Before the city woke, he was already at his post. The moon sat in its predicted position. The fixed stars held their seasonal arrangements above the temple roof. He had checked them against the catalogue his teacher pressed into his hands, and everything was where it was supposed to be. Then, in the hour before dawn, a light appeared that had no name in any catalogue he had ever studied. It moved. It grew brighter. It crossed the arc of the sky on a trajectory that matched nothing he had been trained to expect. He reached for the clay. It was the only response his training had given him for the unexpected. When the sky does something no catalogue anticipates, you record it first and understand it later. The Skywatcher's name has not survived. That is the first problem, and I kept returning to it the way you return to a locked door, not because the door is interesting, but because of what it implies about what lies behind it. I was tracing Mesopotamian administrative records, trying to understand why the earliest proto-cuneiform tablets are almost exclusively economic in content: grain allocations, livestock counts, the bookkeeping of the first cities, when the culture that produced them was already sophisticated enough to track the sky with institutional precision. The accounting left tablets. The sky-watching almost never did. And then I found K.8538. The tablet sits today in the British Museum. Its official designation is straightforward: a Neo-Assyrian circular clay tablet bearing depictions of constellations recovered from the ruins of Nineveh, specifically from the Library of Ashurbanipal, the 7th century BCE Assyrian king who assembled one of the ancient world's most extensive collections of cuneiform texts. The British Museum catalogues it as approximately 700 BCE in date. Not Sumerian, not an eyewitness account, an astronomical and astrological object of the kind Assyrian scribes produced in some numbers, useful for divination and calendar keeping. That would normally be the end of it, a useful astronomical artifact, datable, catalogued, and explained within the well-documented tradition of Assyrian celestial observation. Except for one detail that the catalogue description does not resolve: the distance between 700 BCE and 3123 BCE is worth pausing to calculate. 700 years before the Common Era places this tablet's creation near the era of the Hebrew prophets, the early Greek city-states, and the founding of Carthage. 3,123 years before the Common Era places the proposed event near the earliest phase of Egyptian dynastic history, before Giza, before the Iliad, before anything conventionally called written civilization. The gap between those two dates is approximately 2,400 years. If someone handed you a manuscript written around 1500 CE and told you it preserved, through unbroken scribal copying, a first-hand sky observation made in 900 BCE, you would want to see every link in that chain before accepting it. That chain is exactly what is missing, and exactly what makes K.8538 either a dead end or an extraordinary survivor. The Uruk culture, which produced those earliest proto-cuneiform tablets in southern Mesopotamia, operated during roughly the same window as the proposed 3123 BCE event. Their tablets document the administrative machinery of the first cities: who received the barley, how many sheep crossed the pen. Almost none of it was the sky, but the sky-watching tradition was almost certainly already in practice, maintained through temple hierarchies in forms that left no surviving written record. The absence of the document does not mean the absence of the practice. It means the clay did not survive, or we have not found it. How many temple sky watchers across southern Mesopotamia pressed the same event into clay that night? How many tablets did not survive the next flood season? How many records of whatever crossed that sky remain buried in unexcavated tells beneath the river valleys? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine unknowns, unresolvable with the evidence currently available. The Mesopotamian omen tradition that survives in the cuneiform record is vast and systematic. Recent work on Old Babylonian lunar eclipse omen tablets documents a celestial legal code refined over centuries. An eclipse in 1 month signified the king's death. in another, plague, in another, the destruction of a city by enemy forces. The sky was not decorative, it was the primary political text of the ancient Near East, and every trained temple observer was taught to read it from childhood. What the sky watcher in 3123 BCE saw, if he saw anything, would have been legible to him not as a natural curiosity, but as a sentence, a judgment delivered from above, addressed to whoever held the city. His first obligation, before he understood what he was recording, was to record it. That was what the tradition existed to ensure, not merely the cataloguing of the expected, but the capturing of the unprecedented before memory could soften or distort it. And somewhere between that night and the Library of Ashurbanipal 24 centuries later, something was passed forward, a record, a tradition, a copied text, or a calculation that preserved the geometry of what crossed the sky. The Assyrian scribes who filled Ashurbanipal's library were not passive archivists. They were sent across the known world to gather and copy everything that could be gathered. Some of what they copied was already archaic when they transcribed it. Older languages, older astronomical series, texts whose original context was no longer fully understood by the scribes who preserved them. They were carrying forward knowledge whose meaning had partially decayed in transit, faithful to the form if not always to the interpretation. K.8538 carries no colophon identifying it as a copy of a specific older source. The British Museum catalogue makes no claim of ancient origin. There is no surviving chain of transmission, no dated intermediate copy, no Assyrian note explaining what this record was or where it came from before it arrived on Ashurbanipal's shelves. That silence is not unusual for the library's holdings. Many texts arrived without provenance documentation. It is consequential for any argument about the tablet's deeper origin. What some researchers argue, examining the tablet in detail, is that it is not doing what Neo-Assyrian astronomical objects typically do. It is not projecting forward, it is pointing backward, and what it points toward, they now claim, is a specific morning over Mesopotamia when the catalogue failed and a watcher reached for clay before he understood what he witnessed. The argument arrived from an unexpected direction. Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel were not Assyriologists. They were British aerospace engineers, and it was their training in orbital mechanics and atmospheric trajectory analysis that led them to examine K.8538 in a way no cuneiform specialist had approached it. In 2008, they published their interpretation in the Cuneiform Digital Library Notes, a peer-reviewed journal for cuneiform scholarship. The University of Bristol issued a press release. The claim circulated widely. A press release is not a consensus, and the British Museum did not revise its catalogue entry. But the interpretation was specific enough to take seriously and contested enough to examine with care. It deserved neither reflexive dismissal nor uncritical acceptance. The planisphere is divided into 8 segments, each recording a portion of the night sky. Bond and Hempsel argued that when the star positions inscribed across those segments are rotated backward, to match the sky visible over Mesopotamia in the early hours of June 29th, 3123 BCE, the tablet does not describe a standard astronomical observation. It describes the approach trajectory of a large object crossing the upper atmosphere at approximately 6 degrees above the horizontal. That angle matters. A shallow approach produces a long atmospheric transit, an extended visible trail across a wide arc of sky, rather than a near vertical impact. It generates enormous heat at the leading edge while preserving enough of the object's mass to reach a target on the ground. The specific target that Bond and Hempsel proposed was the Köfels region of the Ötz Valley in the Austrian Alps. The Köfels landslide is real. This is not in dispute. Approximately 9 billion cubic meters of material moved across a valley floor in the Austrian Alps, producing geological signatures that have been studied and debated for more than a century. Early analyses proposed a meteorite impact as the trigger. More recent assessments have favoured seismic origin or glacial undercutting of the valley wall. The dating remains imprecise. Some estimates place the event between 8,000 and 9,800 years ago, well before 3,123 BCE. Other chronological analyses have produced different windows. The uncertainty is genuine, and connecting the proposed trajectory to the Köfels geology requires both the tablet reading and the landslide dating to be correct. Taken together, the argument has the structure of convergence: a tablet that encodes a specific trajectory, a landslide in the proposed impact corridor, a date that emerges from rotating star positions backward through 4,800 years of sky movement. Each element is independently uncertain. Together they form something harder to dismiss than any one piece would be alone. The convergence does not constitute proof, but it does constitute a question that the available evidence cannot yet close. It has never been proven. It has also never been disproven. That double negative is not evasion or intellectual hedging. It is the actual epistemic condition of the question, and any honest account of K.8538 has to begin there. The skeptical response was methodical, and it addressed the chain at multiple points. The first concern is translation. Reading Cuneiform is not like reading an equation. Which symbols represent which stars, which segments of the planisphere correspond to which sky regions. These determinations involve expert judgment at every step, and different scholars examining the same tablet have produced different star maps. The geometry that yields a June 29th, 3123 BCE trajectory under Bond and Hempsel's translation choices may yield an entirely different result under a different, equally defensible set of readings. The second concern is physical evidence. A bolide large enough to produce a major airburst over populated terrain would have deposited a detectable signature in ice cores and tree ring sequences from the period. Some researchers have pointed to climatic disruption in the 32nd century BCE. Others argue the proxy record lacks the resolution to confirm a single event. A smaller bolide, a comet, an atmospheric entry that generated spectacular light and heat without a ground impact all remain possible. Venus in an unusual apparition has explained ancient sky terror accounts before. Volcanic haze from a documented eruption in this period could have distorted visibility enough to produce a phenomenon no catalogue had seen. The third concern is scribal practice itself. Back calculation was a documented Assyrian method. Trained astronomical scribes could project celestial positions backward by centuries to determine what the sky had looked like on any significant date, for astrological, calendrical, or commemorative reasons that had nothing to do with preserved disaster memory. A tablet recording the sky over Mesopotamia on June 29th, 3123 BCE does not require that anyone observed that sky. It may record what a mathematician calculated the sky looked like. The date may be a calculation artifact carrying a meaning it was never intended to bear. What none of these responses fully resolves is the Köfels question. The landslide happened. Something moved 9 billion cubic meters of alpine valley floor, and the physical record of that movement is not in dispute. The tablet exists, and it records the sky with a geometric precision that surprised even researchers who were not looking for an impact event. The official explanation for K.8538 is Assyrian astronomical practice. The anomaly is that the specific date the geometry produces falls inside a window of genuine geological uncertainty for one of the largest single landscape events in European prehistory. There is a problem that sits beneath all the others, and it is not about the tablet or the landslide or the trajectory calculation. It is about the chain itself. Consider what would be required for K.8538 to preserve what Bond and Hempsel proposed. A skywatcher in southern Mesopotamia, sometime around 3123 BCE, observes a catastrophic sky event and records it in sufficient geometric detail to allow a trajectory reconstruction nearly 5 millennia later. That record survives the next several centuries intact. At some point before 700 BCE, an Assyrian scribe encounters it and copies it accurately onto a new clay surface without altering the star positions that encode the original observation. That copy enters the Library of Ashurbanipal. It survives the library's destruction by fire in 612 BCE. It is excavated in the 19th century, shipped to London, catalogued and eventually examined by two aerospace engineers who were not looking for it when they found it. Each link is possible. None is confirmed. The chain is real as a theoretical reconstruction and invisible as a documented record. This is the standard problem of ancient disaster memory, and it is not unique to this tablet. Cultures across the ancient world preserved accounts of catastrophic sky events, fires from above, long winters following unnamed calamities, floods attributed to divine displeasure. Historians and geologists have spent considerable effort matching those traditions to physical events. Sometimes the correspondence is suggestive, sometimes it dissolves on contact with the source material. The difficulty is that oral and scribal traditions do not preserve events the way archives do. They preserve meaning, and meaning is subject to the interpretive pressures of each generation that handles it. A fire from the sky becomes divine judgment. A comet becomes a herald of dynastic collapse. The event itself, stripped of its original observational precision, arrives wearing the interpretive clothing of the culture that transmitted it rather than the culture that first watched it. The tablet is real, the debate is real, the answer is not. What lies between those two established facts and that absent third is everything the discipline of ancient history has to work with. And yet he pressed it into clay before dawn came. He could not have known what would happen to it. He did not know that his city's administrative tradition would give way to Akkadian, which would give way to Babylonian, which would give way to Assyrian. He did not know that a king 24 centuries later would send scribes across the known world to collect everything that could be collected. He pressed signs because his training required it. Because the sky had done something with no entry in any catalogue he had ever studied, and the catalogue existed to be updated. A catalogue that cannot account for what it has not seen is not a failure. It is a record waiting to be extended. When dawn came, the object was gone. The sky held no trace of what had passed through it. The sky returned to its ordinary arrangements. The canals caught the early light. The city began its mourning. Bread bakers, canal workers, priests beginning the temple rites. Nothing in the city immediately burned. No walls fell. Whatever had crossed the sky that night, whether it struck somewhere distant in the mountains or dissipated in the upper atmosphere or passed entirely out the other side of darkness, the city continued, at least for a time, and the watcher continued with it. He had recorded the path. He had noted the altitude and the bearing. He had pressed what he saw into clay with the same precision he would have used for a lunar eclipse or a planetary conjunction. Any datum his successors might one day need. He did not know if anyone would read it. He may not have expected anyone to. The record was the obligation, not the audience. The Assyrian scribe who eventually encountered that record, if it survived long enough to be copied at all, may not have understood what he was transcribing. The Library of Ashurbanipal absorbed texts already archaic in language by the time Assyrian hands touched them. Some scribes added colophons identifying their work as copies of older originals. Some did not. K.8538 carries no such note. Nothing survives explaining where this tablet came from or whether the scribe who copied it knew he was carrying forward the geometry of a sky that had terrified someone in a city whose name he may no longer have been able to read. The library burned in 612 BCE when Nineveh fell. The fire that destroyed the library also, paradoxically, preserved it. Heat baked the clay to a hardness it would not otherwise have achieved. Austin Henry Layard began excavating the ruins in 1849. K.8538 was among the tablets shipped to London, catalogued, shelved, and eventually debated by researchers who could not reach back through the chain and ask the person at its beginning what exactly he had seen before dawn. The distance between that question and its answer has not closed. The clay is still in the British Museum. The star positions pressed into it are still legible. The question of whether they record an eyewitness observation, an Assyrian back calculation, or a memory carried across 24 centuries of scribal tradition remains open in the same way it has remained open since a watcher in southern Mesopotamia reached for clay in the hour before dawn and recorded something the catalogue had no name for. Before the meaning was lost, he pressed it into clay. The clay has not forgotten. We have not yet found a way to ask it the right question.